The last war. It began with a whisper and ended with the roar of forgotten gods. For years, the tensions had simmered beneath the surface, rising like an insidious fever. Small conflicts, border skirmishes, and covert operations across the globe were the prelude. The world was a powder keg, and the matches were too many. No one could remember the moment when the fuse was lit, only that it was too late by the time they realized it had already burned down to the last inch. The first strike came not from the largest superpowers, but from one of the smaller nations that had spent decades building a quiet, deadly force. A missile, nearly undetectable, cut through the sky and obliterated a military base in Europe. It was quick. It was brutal. And it was the catalyst. Nations that had spent years negotiating fragile peace deals now turned on one another with the ferocity of wolves. Old alliances shattered like glass under the pressure of new technologies and the hunger for dominance. The world's great powers, the United States, Russia, China, were poised on the edge of mutual destruction, each watching the others like hawks, waiting for the slightest misstep, the smallest sign of weakness. The United States launched its own retaliatory strike against an unknown target in the Middle East. The message was clear: no one could act without consequence. But the world had grown too complex, too interconnected. The ripple effect of each missile, each bomb, each cyber attack, spread faster than anyone could control. By the time the dust settled, there was no clear victor. Only devastation. In the chaos, cities were swallowed whole. Millions of people, ordinary citizens, had been left behind by the rapid escalation. The lines between the combatants and the civilians blurred. One moment, a child was playing in the park, and the next, the park was gone, reduced to rubble, the child's laughter silenced forever. Technology had advanced to a point where war was no longer fought with soldiers alone. Drones, artificial intelligence, and cyber warfare had taken center stage. Nations no longer had to deploy armies across borders. They only needed to activate a few keystrokes, launch a few drones, and the enemy was crippled before they even knew what was happening. The cyber attacks came in waves, paralyzing communication networks, disabling power grids, and distorting financial markets. Entire economies fell apart within hours. Governments, struggling to maintain control, crumbled into dust. In the vacuum, new powers rose, some corrupt, some idealistic, but none truly prepared for the chaos they had unleashed. The seas turned dark with the wreckage of ships, and the skies were thick with the hum of drones, circling like vultures over the ruins of human civilization. Nations that had once called themselves the free world now struggled to maintain any sense of order. Military leaders became despots, and the fragile lines between government and mercenary were erased. Soldiers were no longer patriots, but contractors, their loyalties no longer to a country, but to the highest bidder. Across the oceans, China, with its vast technological advancements and boundless resources, had initially held back, watching as the Western powers decimated each other. But in the aftermath of the first few months, as the world faltered, China moved in. They began quietly annexing neighboring countries, absorbing weakened states like a tide swallowing a beach. It was methodical, surgical, taking advantage of the fractured, disillusioned world. Meanwhile, Russia, with its long history of military prowess and nuclear weapons, had already begun its own campaign. The nuclear arsenal had been tested, ready to be used if anyone dared challenge their influence. The world stood on the precipice of total annihilation. But there were still those who fought not for power or wealth, but for survival. People like Nadia, a young scientist in Kiev, who had been working on a new energy source that could potentially reshape the war's dynamics. She didn't care about political borders or which superpower was in charge. Her family had already been lost in the early days of the war, when missiles rained down on the city. Nadia's focus was now singular: find a way to stop the madness, to change the course of destruction that seemed inevitable. She and a small group of resistance fighters, now scattered across Europe, had one goal: to stop the escalation. They didn't have weapons, at least, not the kind that could fight back against the firepower of armies. But they had knowledge, and the knowledge could be as dangerous as any bomb. Meanwhile, across the world in the Pacific, Admiral Cheng was leading a coalition of forces that aimed to establish a new order, one that was less about power and more about survival. He had watched his homeland, once thriving and powerful, fall into turmoil. The government had been overthrown by factions, and now he was left leading a makeshift navy, its ships patched together with the remnants of previous conflicts. Cheng had no illusions about what it would take to bring peace, but he knew that a new kind of war was coming, one that was not defined by borders or armies, but by ideology, by the will to survive in the ruins of a broken world. Back in North America, the collapse of the United States government had left a gaping hole. Different factions vied for control over the remains of the country, and the people, disillusioned and desperate, were caught in the middle. There was no law, no order, only the strong preying on the weak. Yet even in the heart of the chaos, there were those who still held hope. Emily, a former teacher turned guerrilla fighter, moved between the shattered remains of cities, trying to find survivors and offer them what little protection she could. It was a long shot, but for her, it was all she had left. And then, there was a final strike. It wasn't nuclear. It wasn't even conventional. It was a moment when the world's last hope, the fragile network of communication and cooperation that still existed between the few remaining governments, finally broke down. A rogue group of hackers, operating in the shadows, launched an EMP blast over the Atlantic, knocking out every last satellite, every communication line, every link between the fractured pieces of humanity. The world was plunged into total darkness. When the light returned, it was not the same world. Entire nations had vanished from the map. The old power structures were no more. The world was a shattered shell, and no one was left to pick up the pieces. Humanity had pushed itself to the brink, and the earth, now scarred by war and famine, seemed as though it might finally take its revenge. Nadia, Admiral Cheng, Emily, all of them were still alive. The survivors. They were scattered, desperate, and broken, but they were not without hope. They knew what the world had once been, and they understood the mistakes of the past. Now, in the desolate remains of civilization, they could only try to rebuild, one step at a time. In the rubble, amidst the silence of the destroyed cities, humanity would begin again. But this time, there would be no great powers, no alliances, no superweapons. Only the raw, unforgiving struggle to survive. The last war had been fought. The future was unknown. But hope, like the smallest ember, still smoldered. And from it, something new might rise.